Welcome Beyond the Text by 6-7. We are diving into a collection of ancient philosophical, esoteric, and, well, secret writings that really force us to redefine what we mean by God and atheism. Forget the common, often superficial debate you hear pitting simple faith against simple rejection. Our sources, they take us far beyond that dichotomy. We are going straight to the core, unpacking the concept of the absolute, the unknowable source of being, the infinite determinate God, and contrasting it sharply with the flawed, the tyrannical and limited concepts of deity that historically sparked doubt and rejection. We'll unpack why the ancient sages embraced paradox, saw the universe as a mechanism of mind, and held that ultimate truth is always hidden, waiting for those who dare to seek beyond the superficial text.
And our mission today really is to give you a kind of shortcut, a shortcut to understanding what is maybe the highest philosophical synthesis of divinity. This is a view where, interestingly, the rejection of the common concept of God isn't atheism at all. It's actually the first step toward true gnosis, toward real knowledge. We are navigating the terrain where metaphysics meets mathematics and where morality is inscribed, quite literally, indelibly on the tablets of universal law.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately. I want to start with the biggest possible concept, defining the deity. The original texts make it instantly clear that the moment we attempt to define God using human language, we fail. That's the core problem they identify right out of the gate. Why is that?
Well, it's because human language is fundamentally built on limitations. I mean, everything we talk about, everything we think about is based on beginnings, ends, causes, effects. And when we try to apply those constructs to the divine, which by its very definition is absolute, infinite, and uncaused, we are committing what you might call a category error. It's like trying to measure water with a ruler.
The tool is just wrong for the job.
Completely wrong. So our sources, they state it very plainly. They say God is the absolute of faith, but the absolute of reason, the only thing our logical minds can grasp is merely being, pure existence.
And this leads directly to that powerful critique of the famous biblical phrase, I am that I am, which the sources we're looking at call a wretched translation. How does that specific phrase, which is so foundational for so many, fall short of describing the absolute?
Well, the Hebrew phrase, Ehai Asher Ehai, is an attempt to convey this idea of pure self-existence. But the problem comes with the translation. By translating it into a declarative personal statement, I am, it still confines an infinite reality into a finite temporal statement. The absolute doesn't declare itself to be, it simply is.
So the act of saying I am already implies a self, a personality, a boundary.
Exactly. The moment you try to place a boundary, an identity, or even a mind capable of forming the thought I am onto the ultimate source, you have already reduced it. You've made it into a comprehensible and therefore limited entity.
That immediately changes the conversation for you, the listener. I mean, if we as humans cannot comprehend what God is in himself, then we are at best worshiping a concept.
Yes, a kind of internal idol.
An internal idol forged by our own limited temporal minds. So we're really just dealing with our idea of the divine, not the deity itself.
It's a profound recognition of human intellectual limits, which is, a hallmark of this kind of ancient wisdom. The source uses a really striking analogy to illustrate the scale of this problem.
What's that?
It says that expecting a human to grasp the idea of self-existence or existence without a beginning is like expecting the hair that grows upon our head to understand the nature and immortality of the soul.
Wow, quick cut.
It's an issue of scale and really of dimensional thinking. Our consciousness is rooted in time and space. It simply cannot conceive of the uncaused cause, the source of being. We can only conceive of the manifestations, the things that sort of trickle down to our reality.
So if the ultimate source is beyond our definition, beyond our language, how do these esoteric traditions even refer to it without, compromising its infinity?
They do it through negation, mostly, by emphasizing what it is not. And this leads us directly to the concept of the ineffable source, which is often identified through the Kabbalistic concept of Ein Sof.
Ein Sof. Okay, let's break that down. Literally, endless or non-finite. Tell us about this supreme, limitless, and unmanifested reality and why it's so crucial to this whole philosophy.
Ein Sof, or sometimes you see it as En Sof, is the absolute before it takes any form, before it limits itself in any way. The sources describe this supreme being as being in also. It's immanent, yet also distinct from all, and fundamentally greater than all. That's its transcendent nature. It is the necessary prerequisite for all existence, but it is not existence as we know it. Its name is ineffable, meaning it can't be spoken or written. It's beyond all attributes.
And the only word the sources suggest for this reality is light. They call it Aorh Ein Sof, the light of the non-finite.
Wow.
Why light? What's so special about that word?
Because light, in these texts, isn't a physical phenomenon. It's not the light from a lamp. It's pure concept, pure potential. The source specifies that this light filled the entire where before creation. It's not localized. It's the universal field of possibility. It's the substance of consciousness, the precondition for all subsequent reality. It's really the only word that's capable of suggesting infinity without actually defining it. It's everywhere, but it's nowhere specific.
This concept of the absolute, this has to be the starting point for addressing atheism, because if this is the benchmark for divinity, then almost every common religious caricature of God just falls completely short.
That is precisely the core of what we're calling the anti-atheist argument. The problem arises when people adopt a limited, a mechanistic view of the divine. A very common error, one that provides ripe ground for atheism, is believing that God is merely a master architect, a kind of cosmic watchmaker. The source has this great line. It says, they imagine God as one who, having finished the immense machine of the universe, sits ever since and sees it go.
That's such a predictable, limited concept. A being who just starts a clock and then walks away. If that's the only concept of God you're presented with, then of course rational rejection is the logical conclusion.
Exactly. I mean, if God is just a limited, predictable, and occasionally arbitrary architect, then he is ripe for rejection. So our sources posit that atheism, in this philosophical context, may not be a rejection of the infinite absolute at all. It's more likely a rejection of that flawed, mechanical, overly humanized architect figure.
That is a profound statement. It suggests that a person who is deemed an atheist by society may in fact hold a higher, pure conception of the divine than those who adhere to a dogma centered on, say, a jealous, limited, or vengeful tribal deity.
The source suggests exactly that. It says that atheism may be applied to a man who holds a higher, pure conception of the divine than what is commonly taught by, orthodox organized religions. And we see this dynamic play out historically, most notably with the Gnostics.
This is where it gets really compelling. The Gnostics, a group dedicated to secret knowledge, to enlightenment, they explicitly looked at the God of the Old Testament and said, that's not the absolute.
That's correct. They saw a figure that was jealous, vengeful, limited, that needed sacrifice, that made petty interventions, and they said this can't be the ultimate source.
Yeah.
So they transferred all those perceived defects onto a specific, created, and flawed entity they called the demiurge, or sometimes Yaldabaoth.
The demiurge. So he's not the ultimate God, he's more like a middle manager.
A middle manager who thinks he's the CEO. That's a perfect analogy. They viewed Yaldabaoth not as the ultimate source, but as a limited, blind, and arrogant being who created the flawed material world.
Wait, so the Gnostics effectively needed a philosophical scapegoat. They needed a character to take the fall for all the perceived imperfections in the physical world and in the biblical narrative, so that their belief in the true absolute God could remain pristine.
Precisely. By delegating the physical world's creation and governance to this flawed demiurge, who was himself a limited, created being, a son of chaos, they were able to maintain a belief in a separate, perfect, supreme God. A God of holiness and love who was utterly unblemished and, as the text says, had no connection whatever with the sensible world. This supreme God was pure spirit, pure light, the Ein Sof.
So the argument is, the rejection of the limited, the rejection of the demiurge is not atheism. It's a necessary step in seeking the truly ineffable God, the Ein Sof.
This is the critical takeaway for you, the learner, from this first section. The anti-atheist argument is built on the premise that true divinity can't be rejected because it can't be defined or contained in the first place. You can only reject the definition. Once you understand that the problem lies not in the existence of the infinite, but in the limits of human conception, the entire debate just shifts. We move from arguing about belief to arguing about understanding.
And that leads us to the next massive challenge. If the absolute, the Ein Sof, is unknowable, infinite, and ineffable light, how does anything finite, changeable, and material like us, like the universe, even come into existence? We need that conceptual bridge between the infinite and the finite.
And that bridge is the first emanation. It's known almost universally in these ancient traditions as the Word, or the Logos. This is the mechanism by which the absolute expresses itself and initiates the whole process of creation.
So it's not an external command from a king on a throne. It's more like an internal self-expression. God's thought, springing up within himself, is immortal as himself, and this thought becomes the Word.
Exactly. Think of it as the ultimate thought form, the divine blueprint for everything that will follow. The word, or logos, is the actual vehicle by which God acts on the universe. It's the world of ideas, the reservoir of perfect forms by which all visible things are eventually created. The sources emphasize this almost mathematically. They quote the famous line, "The Word was in the beginning, was with God, and was God."
It is the light and perfect reason of the great, silent, supreme, uncreated deity. And in different traditions, this gets different names, right? In Egyptian terms, it's Nith, the primitive thought. It's the dynamic force that moves everything from potentiality into reality.
It's the mechanism of translation. It moves existence from the pure potentiality of the absolute being into the manifested, rational, ordered world that we can actually observe. The Logos establishes the rules of the cosmos. It is divine reason made manifest.
This transition from pure reason to sensible matter makes the communication problem even more acute. If the ultimate truths are too refined for human language, and if the Logos is the mechanism, then symbols must be the essential language used to convey these ideas to the masses.
Symbolism becomes absolutely vital. It's necessary because abstract ideas require sensible images for the multitude to grasp. The initiates, the philosophers, they might have grasped the pure idea, but the masses needed an allegory, a story, a physical form they could revere and understand.
This sounds pragmatic, but also inherently dangerous. The text explicitly warns of this danger, doesn't it?
It does. The danger is pronounced. The imagination, which is called in merely to assist reason in grasping the concept, often usurps its place entirely. The symbol becomes the object of worship, rather than the abstract truth it was meant to represent. The shadow is mistaken for the substance.
And that usurpation is precisely where the original pure philosophy degrades into rigid dogma, or even worse, idolatry. The sources are startlingly candid about this dilution process.
They are. They argue that religion, in order to gain currency and influence over the great mass of mankind, must be alloyed with such an amount of error that it places it far below the standard attainable by the higher human capacities.
Wait, hold on. That's a radical philosophical justification for religious error. Are they actually saying that a certain amount of error is necessary for the social function of religion?
They are. The idea is that what is pure truth to the highly developed philosopher would not be truth, or at least it wouldn't have the necessary psychological and moral effect of truth to the peasant who is struggling with immediate material concerns. The subtle truth must be simplified, dramatized, and often personified. And this means the higher truth must be committed to the few, the initiates, to preserve their purity, while the many receive the allegory best suited to their level of comprehension.
So this is the whole reason for the existence of esoteric traditions. To preserve the philosophical meaning hidden inside the public mythos. We see this translation of the absolute into understandable terms through symbolic archetypes across all ancient cultures. Let's really drill down on the most universal example, the sun.
The sun is the most ancient and widespread symbol of the life-giving and generative power of the deity, the essence of light. And why? It's obvious in a way. The sun is the visible, tangible, undeniable source of life and warmth in our observable world. It is the visible agent of the Logos.
It's the principle of divine action, made manifest for us to see every day.
Exactly. So when the sources refer to the sun as Kur, Kurum, Osiris, Bel, and Mithras, they're not suggesting 5 different gods. They are pointing to 5 different cultural vestments for the exact same underlying concept. The central, illuminating, creative force that brings order and life out of darkness. The sun's cyclical journey, its power to bring life out of the darkness of winter, makes it the perfect vehicle for illustrating the action of the divine Logos.
And the sun is immediately connected to the cosmos and to numbers, which brings us to the sacred nature of the number 7.
The number 7 is sacred precisely because it reflects the structure of the cosmos as the ancients understood it. You had the 7 visible planets, which led to the idea of 7 spheres, 7 archangels, 7 colors in the rainbow, 7 notes in the musical scale. This isn't just superstition. It was an early form of scientific classification, an attempt to map the divine order, the Logos' established structure, onto the visible universe. It provided a sense of comfort and predictability in a chaotic world.
And we also see the concept of divine emanation and creation consistently structured as triads, always expressing a generative power, a passive principle, and a product. This structure seems to be everywhere.
It's the philosophical scaffolding of the universe. I mean, look at the Egyptian trinity. Osiris is the generative power, the active male principle. Isis is the passive principle, primitive matter, the fertile recipient. And Horus is the sun, the cosmos, the physical animated product. Plato mirrors this exactly with his own triad. Thought is the father, primitive matter is the mother, and cosmos is the son, the ordered world. These are not separate theological inventions. They are three different languages trying to express the same mechanical relationship between the absolute and the created world.
That structural uniformity, Osiris, Isis, Horus, always equaling thought, matter, cosmos, it really shows the underlying philosophical unity the ancient sages were preserving, regardless of the cultural wrapping paper.
And this philosophical framework culminated in powerful symbols that were used for instruction. We see this synthesis in the familiar Masonic symbol, the point within a circle and bordered by two perpendicular parallel lines, with the Holy Scriptures resting on top.
This is where we need to translate the abstract back into the concrete ritual. If the temple is the universe, as they say, what does this specific emblem tell us about cosmic order?
It is incredibly dense with cosmological meaning. The point within the circle symbolizes the sun, the source of light and life, the visible representative of the generative deity. The circle itself represents the universe, or the boundless extent of God's power.
And the two parallel lines, they're often explained in modern rites as St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist.
And while that serves a specific historical and sectarian purpose, the deeper, more profound meaning, the one that connects it back to the universal laws we're discussing, is that they symbolize the necessary equilibrium of nature. They represent the sun's journey between the solstices. They mark the northern and southern limits of the sun's annual path, establishing the boundaries of time, of season, of celestial law.
Ah, so there are the boundary lines, the limits of the logos, the definition of the cosmic machine's operational parameters.
Precisely. The entire symbol is a microcosm, a small-scale representation of the universe governed by cosmic order, law, and balance. And the Holy Scriptures, or the volume of sacred law, resting on top, provides the ethical and moral law that is necessary for us to navigate this ordered universe.
This emphasis on visible order, the sun, the stars, the seasons, all these geometric symbols, it shows that the ancients saw the temple not just as a building, but as a symbolic representation of the universe itself. They saw it as having for its roof the starred vault of heaven. The cosmos was the first lodge.
And this leads us to the critical realization. The esoteric knowledge, the deeper philosophical meaning, was the light by which these symbols, emblems, and ornaments must be viewed. Otherwise, they become mere empty rituals, or worse, they lead back to the limited idol worship that the philosophers were trying to transcend in the first place. The logos is the light. Symbolism is the vessel necessary to carry that light to humanity.
That transitions perfectly into the ultimate philosophical paradox. If the universe operates according to the light of the logos and the ordered symbols of this cosmic machine, we have to address the moral universe. That is, the inherent conflict between God's necessity, his omnipotent foreordained will, and man's liberty, his genuine free will.
This is the great enigma. It's the one that every ancient philosophy had to solve to reconcile the absolute power of God with the moral agency of humanity. The sources identify the two great columns supporting the temple, which again symbolizes the universe as necessity, the omnipotent will of God, and liberty, the free will of his creatures.
And the solution isn't one winning over the other. The key word that unites these two apparent antagonists is equilibrium. They are held in what the ancient texts call harmonious ponderation.
We should probably translate that phrase for the listener. Harmonious ponderation essentially means a perfect working balance. The distinction and harmonious ponderation of contrary forces is declared to be the single and absolute law of nature. Everything in the universe, from, an electron to a solar system, maintains its stability through the balance of opposing forces, attraction and repulsion, light and shadow.
And this balance is often symbolized in their numerical systems, isn't it?
Yes. This is why the sources are so focused on symbolic geometry and numbers. They cite the philosophical stone, which is a cube, representing ultimate stability achieved through balanced forces. They also mention the Kabbalistic number 4, or the tetragram.
Let's define that term clearly for everyone. The tetragram is the four-letter divine name, YHVH. What does the number 4 symbolize in this context of equilibrium?
It symbolizes the completeness and stability of the material world. We have 4 elements, 4 seasons, 4 cardinal directions. The number 4 gives things structure and physical reality. So the tetragram, the word made manifest, is the representation of these 4 forces held in perfect dynamic balance, ensuring that the universe, despite its vastness and complexity, remains stable. Necessity and liberty must operate within this stable, ordered system.
But I need to inject some skepticism here. How can God's infinite power and wisdom, which foreknows everything that will happen, be entirely consistent with the actual freedom of human action? If he knows I'm going to choose coffee over tea tomorrow, did I truly have a choice? It really seems like a contradiction in terms that just neuters free will.
And that is the limit of our linear, sequential human reason. Our sources argue that God's power and wisdom could so arrange the laws of action that human free will is entirely consistent with divine omnipotence. The key is that divine foreknowledge does not cause the action.
So knowing isn't the same as forcing.
Exactly. Think of it this way. Our freedom is found in the impulse we apply to matter. Every act begins with a free, conscious choice. That is our light, our liberty. The moment we act, that impulse is free, even if the ultimate consequence of that action is determined by immutable, inevitable law.
Okay, so necessity governs the consequence, but liberty governs the initial spark of the action.
Precisely. God does not need to intervene constantly, because the machine of the universe, the mechanism of the logos, is perfectly calibrated to respond justly to the initial impulse of liberty. The laws are already in place.
This equilibrium brings us directly to the thorniest problem in all of philosophy, the problem of evil and suffering, also known as theodicy. If God is good and omnipotent, why do pain, misfortune, and injustice exist in the world? How do these ancient texts justify the existence of suffering?
They tackle this head-on. They assert that evil is temporary and that it exists for beneficent purposes. It is defined purely as the necessary shadow of the good, inseparable from it, just as darkness is inseparable from the projection of light. If you have light, you must have shadow. If you have being, you must have non-being. There is no other way.
Wait, just so I'm clear, are you saying that suffering is not a divine oversight or a mistake, but is actively willed by God as a necessary function of the best possible universal laws? That's a very hard conclusion for a listener who's struggling with real hardship.
The sources are uncompromising on this point. They argue that the apparent disorders of the physical world are not disorders despite God's power. They are actively willed by him as the inevitable consequences of the laws he established, the laws of consequence, and the reason. The reason is because if there were no physical evil, no hardship, no loss, no danger, there would be no possible virtue.
Unpack that. What kind of virtue are we talking about here?
We are talking about the virtues that define true human excellence and spiritual ascent. Virtues like patience, perseverance, submission, energy, endurance, and fortitude. These virtues require resistance. They require friction. You can't develop strength without lifting something heavy. The world is perfectly adapted to the destiny of man, whose supreme object is the good, and whose law is virtue. If everything were effortless, these defining characteristics of the soul would never be developed. Suffering is the raw material from which excellence is forged, and thus it serves a necessary, albeit terrible, beneficent purpose.
That gives a very stark view of consequence. Pain and sorrow are presented not as arbitrary punishments from a capricious deity, but as the inevitable consequences that flow from sin and vice, as effect flows from cause, inscribed indelibly on the tablets of universal nature.
And this point is absolutely central to the esoteric view of justice, and it is immutable. The sources emphatically state that even the omnipotence of God cannot uncommit a deed. It cannot make that undone which has been done. Because existence operates under eternal, unchangeable law, every single action, every moral decision bears its allotted fruit according to those laws. Period.
So the system is perfectly just because it's perfectly logical and unchangeable. God doesn't need to sentence us to hellfire. We create our own future consequences instantly, simply by adhering to or violating the universal laws of cause and effect.
Exactly. And this immutable reality is viewed as a far more powerful and reliable moral foundation than the threat of arbitrary hellfire or the promise of easy transactional forgiveness. It shifts the focus entirely from seeking favor from a personified deity to aligning your will with the eternal moral calculus of the cosmos.
This brings us to the nature of morality itself. If it's not dictated by a rulebook from on high, where does it come from?
Morality is described as faith in full bloom, but it's more than just belief. It is a fundamental force that acts like a kind of moral magnetic attraction toward truth and virtue. Furthermore, justice and truth are not arbitrary creations of God's decree. They are of God's very essence. They exist eternally in God, independent of his mere will.
So God cannot decide tomorrow that murder is moral.
No, absolutely not. God is the principle of morality because his will is the expression of eternal, absolute, uncreated justice. He doesn't invent justice. He is justice. The cosmos reflects this perfect, uncreated justice.
But this eternal law of consequence, it still produces apparent injustice in the limited sphere of our lives. The sources mention, for example, a child suffering for the father's vices, a consequence flowing through generations. How does the philosophy reconcile that profound temporal injustice?
This is the necessary bridge to the idea of perpetuity, of an existence beyond this one life. The great general plan and system enacted by God continually produce what, to our limited notions bounded by our brief lifespan, appears as wrong and injustice. Because the law of cause and effect is inexorable, and the effect flows through the physical world, innocent people will suffer from the consequences initiated by others. That's a fact of the system.
And this necessity, the consequence flowing from cause through generations, causing these temporal imbalances, this is what compels the hypothesis of a compensated afterlife.
It necessitates it. Justice is described as an angel of God flying from east to west, ensuring that merit and demerit equally subsist, regardless of whether reward or punishment is immediately received in this physical plane. The soul, which is the repository of these choices and consequences, must have continuity to experience the ultimate, perfect resolution of the moral equation. This is the only way to justify a painful but ultimately ordered physical universe.
We started by seeking the ineffable absolute, and we navigated the inexorable laws of equilibrium and consequence. So, what is the ultimate work required of the soul in this carefully balanced yet painful universe? What is the point of all this esoteric knowledge?
The purpose of all this esoteric knowledge, this deep dive into philosophy and science, is not sectarian dogma or what the text dismissively calls cheap common school knowledge. The goal is nothing less than manhood, science, and philosophy. And these are not separate studies, but one grand work.
And that grand work is initiation.
Yes, the great work of initiation is to recall the soul to what is truly good and beautiful, and to facilitate its return from its current exile, where it is enchained in matter as in a dark prison, back to the celestial splendors from which it came. The material world, governed by the demiurge in the Gnostic sense, is a temporary, dark environment that is designed to test the soul.
That framing the soul as an exile chained in matter, it really explains why the pursuit of knowledge is supposed to be so difficult. It's a lifelong struggle for inner perfection against the resistance of the physical world.
And the highest purpose of man is dual. First, to attain the truth, which is science and philosophy. And second, to serve our fellows, our country, and mankind, which is manhood. The sources are very clear that action is superior to mere description. It is a nobler thing to be a hero than to describe one. The true initiate labors for the benefit of those who are to come after him.
But they also elevate thought to the level of action. That's an interesting point.
They absolutely do. They state that a thought is as much the end of life as an action, and sometimes works greater results. This ties back into the idea of the logos and the creation of consequence. Every single thought, every internal moral choice contributes to the current of universal nature, shaping not only one's own destiny, but the destiny of humanity.
So even the unconsidered act of the poorest of men may fire the train that leads to the subterranean mine, and an empire be rent by the explosion. That's a massive responsibility placed on human consciousness.
It is a profound, eternal influence. We are constantly reminded that every moral act, every thought is inscribed indelibly on the tablets of universal nature. We are, by our very existence and consciousness, creating an irrevocable legacy of consequence. There is no moral vacuum. Nothing is ever lost.
And while pursuing this difficult path of truth and action, the source material points to an undenied gospel, regardless of what one believes about creeds, dogmas, or miracles. What are they referring to?
So they're referring to the life and character of the great master who taught in Galilee. They hold it up as worthy of all imitation. And this is a philosophical recognition, independent of any sectarian theology. The life, characterized by pure self-sacrifice, forgiveness, and universal philanthropy, is set forth as the perfect blueprint for ethical conduct.
It's the practical application of the logos in human form. The idea being that if the world were populated by individuals living according to that model, the moral universe would be perfected. All social ills, coercion, injury, selfishness, revenge, they would just disappear instantly.
And that life, stripped of all metaphysical claims, stands as an undenied and undeniable gospel of practical morality. It sets the standard for the conduct required for the soul's ascent from its prison of matter.
This entire deep dive has been about finding the perfect balance, the equilibrium between necessity and liberty, between spirit and matter. The ultimate synthesis of this work, the subjugation of the human by the divine, is symbolized perfectly in the tools of the builder, the square and compass.
The symbology here is absolute and mathematical. The great work, the core of this philosophy, is defined as the subjugation of the human that is in man by the divine, the conquest of the appetites and passions by the moral sense and the reason. And this is not just a poetic statement, it's mapped geometrically.
Okay, unpack the map for us, because this is where the philosophical idea gains real structure.
Right, so the square, which rests on the earth, represents the material and human nature, our physical appetites, our earthbound existence. The square is measured by the number 4. This represents the 4 elements, the 4 dimensions of physical reality, the material completeness of the tetragram. It's the physical self.
And the compass.
The compass represents the spiritual and divine nature, and it's measured by the number 3. This relates to the triads we discussed, thought, matter, and cosmos, but here it symbolizes the 3 spiritual attributes that must govern the 4 material ones: wisdom, strength, and beauty. Or you could say mind, will, and love.
And when the human nature, the 4, is sufficiently subjugated and perfected by the divine, the 3, they achieve harmony or completion.
Yes. The union of 3, spiritual governance, and 4, material reality, produces the number 5, harmony. This is the sacred geometry of the 3-4-5 right-angled triangle, the Pythagorean theorem. This mathematical precision reinforces the philosophical concept. Equilibrium is achievable, but only when the higher principle, the spiritual, controls the lower one, the material.
That gives a very concrete goal to the whole journey. The degree of control the compass exerts over the square reflects the initiate's spiritual dominion over his material self. To achieve this 3-4-5 harmony is the true work of the soul, the necessary labor to escape the darkness of the material prison and realize true manhood.
It means every day, every moment, you are either allowing the square to rule the compass, letting your appetites and passions determine your actions, or you are using the compass to describe and govern the acceptable limits of the square. You're thereby aligning your immediate choices with the eternal, unchangeable laws of justice and truth. That's how you build your virtue, choice by choice.
As we look back at this intense exploration, the primary insight we've gained is that the deepest wisdom entirely bypasses the rigid dichotomy of God versus no God. The argument is just far more sophisticated.
It is. The sophisticated seeker realizes that arguing over whether a limited anthropomorphic figure, a demiurge, an arbitrary architect exists, is a complete distraction. The focus shifts entirely to the eternal, unchangeable laws of being, equilibrium, and consequence. These forces operate whether or not we choose to personify them as a deity or understand their ultimate source as the Ein Sof.
And we've seen that the rejection often called atheism is really an elevation, a refusal to accept a flawed conception in favor of something higher and purer, much like the Gnostics rejected the demiurge. And the path forward is clear. Work, suffering for virtue, and the knowledge that every action, even every thought, is irrevocably recorded.
And this profound truth of consequence leaves us with a final thought for you, the learner. The ancient sages believed that the spiritual path, the ascent of the divine, was more tedious or laborious depending on how much the soul was clogged by the gross impediments of its sins and vices. Your moral inertia today determines the difficulty of your journey tomorrow.
If God's purpose is not to reward belief, but to ensure spiritual growth through consequence and inescapable law, if you cannot uncommit a deed, this raises a very important question. What immediate, irreversible action or decision are you making today that will be inscribed indelibly on the tablets of universal nature? What legacy of consequence are you creating right now?